Women's rights that I believe, from speaking to women, that they want us to be talking about is violence against women and girls, not being able to get a gynecology appointment, the gender pay gap.
You can't say what women's rights are because you're not one. J.K. Rowling is one, and she stands up for women. So you can't prioritise.
She's one woman, as you are.
That sounds mildly stupid.
If you are a woman, then you're one woman with an opinion.
And I saw a comment like, wow, he totally exposed her hypocrisy by pointing out she isn't trans, but she has an opinion on trans rights. Get wrecked. So there are two massive issues with this statement. The first that warrants pointing out is that she didn't express an opinion on trans rights. She expressed an opinion on women's rights and said that what women are being told to tolerate by whomever and for whatever reason is a breach of those rights.
I feel like this is going to be one of those videos that has the same tone as a white person saying that I'm arguing for my rights as an individual for black people not to use my water fountain. How's it going, guys? If you're new here, my name is Suris, and if you value honest and fair political conversations that try to make politics a little less miserable to deal with, then do me a favor, subscribe, and tell a couple friends what I'm doing over here. Today, we're gonna be going over a video called No Trans Identity Means No Opinion. And you've already kind of got the flavor of it in the beginning, but the basic idea is that the player that you've kind of got the basic idea of what we're dealing with, but I'll very quickly go over it. We are looking at a clip from Facebook of a couple of individuals having an argument, one saying that she's arguing in favor of women's rights, and another saying that, okay, but if you're arguing against trans people, and your argument about somebody being able to have an opinion on women's rights is if they're not an opinion, they don't get an opinion on that, then you also should have the same ideas when it comes to trans people. You don't get an opinion if you're not trans. Now, I do not agree with either of these statements. I believe that there are people who can end up advocating against themselves while still being part of whatever minority or marginalized group. And there are people that actually take financial benefit for arguing against themselves and, as a result, trying to say that allies don't get opinions is a dumb position. But the actual subject of today's video is King Critical, saying that somehow these positions are not actually identical. So let's go ahead and see what clarification there is on that.
Rights. Specifically, the right to privacy and dignity in not being obligated to have men in their single-sex spaces. And the point there is it is the women's rights themselves that matter, not the supposed right of whoever is telling them to sacrifice their right.
Okay, again, this is literally white people saying, I don't want black people in my bathroom. This is white people saying, I don't want black people at my water fountain. The argument is identical. You can just say that, oh, this is actually an argument about women's rights, but that doesn't actually mean that that's what's really on trial here. Because if the conversation is trans women's access to these things, you're telling me that Boy Trashada belongs in the men's restroom, and that would somehow make things safer, and that Ben Melzer belongs in the women's restroom, and that will also somehow make those places safer. It's a position that sounds super reasonable when you say it, and then when you analyze reality, it doesn't actually make things safer for anybody. And then when it comes to enforcement, you end up having cis women, people who were born female and act as female, getting kicked out of restrooms for not passing as female due to either being not as attractive as somebody might want, or having PCOS, or literally anything else. Like, again, it's a position that sounds somewhat reasonable until you scrutinize it and actually look at reality.
And indeed, the implication of saying you need to know about who is asking you to give up your rights is that your rights are violable depending on who's trying to violate them. An expert on Palestine who knows a lot about Palestinians might say Israel shouldn't exist. It is a violation of the Palestinians' rights to national self-determination to establish a foreign ethno-state on their land. In that case, the response, well, you're not Jewish, so why are you attacking Israel's right to exist, would be completely incoherent because Jewishness, and indeed Israel, has nothing to do with it.
You're right, but again, this is the exact same thing when we're talking about trans people. If you're not trans, then there are aspects of the trans experience that you will not have access to naturally. So when somebody says, you're not a woman, you don't get an argument on women's rights, the correct response is, well, you're not trans, then you don't get an opinion. So either all of us who want to advocate for the things that we think are important get to advocate for them, or none of us do.
It's not as if the Palestinians would be totally okay if there was a Hungarian, Australian, or Outer Mongolian ethno-state being established on their land. I don't need to know anything about anyone else's rights to say that they can't take my house, say it's part of their country and the rightful property of the citizens of their country who are in fact foreign invaders. I only need to know my right.
You're right, but none of your rights are actually violated by a trans person existing in your space. There is no right of yours that suddenly disappears because a trans woman is in the bathroom with you. In fact, I guarantee you everybody watching this video has been in a bathroom with a trans person and not known it. This is because a lot of trans women who are comfortable going into the bathroom pass as women, and therefore you would have no way of knowing if they were in there or not. And again, in the bathroom, especially the women's bathroom, we're talking about private stalls. So most of the time when somebody's in the bathroom, you have no way of knowing that they're in there in the first place. The most you see is their legs and their feet through the stalls if you're in an American bathroom. I don't know what it's like everywhere else, but I know that that's how America's bathrooms are. They're weirdly open, while still having a modicum of privacy.
And of course, you always know a group is in the wrong when they start talking about their right to exist. Nobody ever retreats to broadly declaring that they have a right to exist unless their existence is entirely about contravening the actual material rights of other people.
What the fuck are you talking about? Because there's plenty of people who argue that they have a right to exist because, I don't know, there's like an ongoing genocide of something, and that happens to be them. Like, I don't know. This feels like a point that doesn't actually have any saliency, my guy. If somebody is arguing that they have a right to exist, then that does not mean, like, that's actually a logical fallacy that it automatically means that their right to exist impedes on yours. If you're familiar with how marketing works, all you have to do to convince people that the rights of somebody else impedes on your rights is for a clever rhetorician to tell you that, to convince you of that. And if they can convince enough people, Rush Limbaugh style, then you're going to have people who think that the rights of another person somehow create a zero-sum game where they lose rights. And in an environment where that conversation has been happening in that way for over a decade, you're going to have people who start arguing that their right to exist should be something that is respected, because at the end of the day, if they're being told they're not allowed to exist in several spaces, especially private spaces that they're not harming anybody in the first place, then it becomes your right to exist out in the world with other people in general. That becomes the thing you end up having to argue against.
And of course, you always know a group is in the wrong when they start talking about their right to exist.
Yep, I guess all the Jews were in the wrong when they had a right to exist that they wanted to advocate for in Nazi Germany. I'm sorry, we're going to do the Godwin's Law thing, but if I can find examples where you're fucking wrong, then I guess you're fucking wrong.
Nobody ever retreats to broadly declaring that they have a right to exist unless their existence is entirely about contravening the actual material rights of other people.
Then I guess when the NIFB is arguing that gay people should be slaughtered in the streets and a gay person says that they have a right to exist, the gay person, are somehow the one in the wrong here. My guy, I'm just curious, do you have brain cells? You have books behind you, like a lot of books behind you. I'm hoping that you actually read any of them. Because again, this feels like a point that somebody only makes when they do not actually know what the hell they're talking about.
And that's the issue of Zach Polanski saying that this comment about women's rights is actually about trans rights. It speaks to the narcissism of trans activism. They think this is a huge dunk because this woman isn't trans, but she's talking about trans rights because they don't think women's rights are a legitimate thing to talk about.
No, nobody said women's rights aren't a legitimate thing to talk about. Not one person. Again, I believe you have not read any of the books behind you, because you are showing me that in a world where reading comprehension is necessary, you invariably lack it. Not one person has said women's rights don't matter. Not one person has said women's rights aren't worth talking about. The argument is that if somebody tries to argue that you can't have a position on something if you're not a woman, then we are now in the world where our identity status is the only thing that allows us to have an opinion on something. And if that's the case, then not being trans automatically means you don't get an opinion on trans issues. Again, this is a position that is dumb and I do not agree with, but that is the argument being made here. Argue against that one, not the straw man you created.
A neutral perspective, it seems clear. She is a woman, she's concerned about women's rights, so she opposes any group that conflicts with those rights. It's only trans ideologues who insist on working backwards that because one of those groups is trans people, therefore her entire motivation must be being anti-trans.
No, it's not that they're working backwards, it's that that's what we've historically seen. I'm going to provide a study on this in the description below because I think rhetoric is a thing that people really, really feel convinced by, but I think data and analysis is far more important. But if we skip to the conclusion of this just for the sake of the video, there's been a recent surge in legislation that tries to limit the rights of transgender people, specifically by framing it as a renewed push for establishing norms around gender binaries. Scholars of this have been noting that this has been a problem for over a decade. There's a part here that's relevant to the conversation about the framing of issues by political actors reveals the interconnectedness of inequality across a spectrum of identities. Legislators and lobbyists supporting anti-trans legislation are using paternal frames that center on gender essentialism. Specifically, right-wing mobilization against trans individuals adopts frames that are present in other political battles, like the backlash to women's rights more broadly. The idea that the right wing, at least in America, a group of people who have historically been opposed to women's rights, are now suddenly the champions of women's rights because they have a convenient scapegoat is what this study looks at. How groups that actually end up being anti-feminist or really anti-women's rights in general can use clever marketing and rhetoric to convince people that while they strip rights away from them, like rights to abortion, they're actually advocating for their safety by defending their rights to be in the bathroom, which they weren't losing in the first place. And again, for decades, trans people have been going into the bathroom of their gender and it's not caused any problems up until now. So again, this is all literally just marketing. There's also a write-up on all this that you should see from the Williams Institute. There's an entire section in here about the specific development of the bathroom argument. It goes into the fact that there actually was a singular group in 2007 that was arguing against gay marriage and same-sex attraction being a thing that was perfectly natural and okay, tried to shift their focus to schools and telling schools that they couldn't tell people it's okay to be gay. They formed the website notmyshower.com that posed the argument that young girls would find themselves undressing next to men in locker rooms. From this point on, we started seeing an increase in arguments about LGBT rights being stripped away from people because we were trying to protect women from sexual predators in bathrooms. I'm going to provide a link to another study in the description as well that shows that the actual fear about safety in these bathrooms when you have trans people in them is not based on any empirical data whatsoever. The historical precedent for all of these anti-trans bill arguments is from groups who tried to eliminate LGBTQ rights as a whole and failed to do so. So they found a convenient scapegoat that they could convince people of and have been working tirelessly for 2 decades to convince people that that scapegoat is a real threat. So even if you sit there and say, oh, well, the conversation is actually about women's rights because it's their right to safety they're arguing about, you can be technically correct and then all the data can show that you're actually wrong. Because if their issue is about public safety, then trans people are not the biggest threat that they actually have to worry about, nor are they a statistically significant threat.
It's also true that just thinking in terms of your rights might lead to you lacking a sense of perspective and identifying as rights what are actually privileges.
Whether something's a right or a privilege is ultimately a semantic argument, and it doesn't really do a whole lot to shape the material reality for people who have to actually live here day to day. That said, arguing that somebody only looking after their own rights can invariably cause them to not think of the ways it infringes on other people's rights is actually a good point, and I will grant that one to you. So if you and I both agree that the toilet is a basic human right that everybody should have access to, and that a public toilet that is publicly available is not truly a private space, then surely there's no problem with women sharing the space with other women, trans or otherwise.
You know, if you think you have a right to something, but you can only have that thing with the systemic oppression of other people, that's not really something you have a right to. So with that said, you should take a moment to try and look at things from the perspective of people who are saying that they have certain rights that you might think go against what you consider to be your rights. Absolutely. The issue is that Zach didn't say, hey, you're not realizing that sometimes trans rights and women's rights might conflict. There needs to be some sort of balance, so you should consider things from the trans perspective. Instead, he's acting like her opinions on trans rights are totally separate from any concern about women's rights, as if there was some hypocrisy on her part.
But there is hypocrisy on her part. You see, when she makes the essentialist argument that the only way you can have an opinion that matters on women's rights is by being a woman, as if the father of a daughter or the husband of a wife or somebody who happens to be non-binary, suddenly their opinion does not matter merely because of the circumstances of their birth, the counter to that is that, okay, if we're walking into that realm, then let's both walk into that realm and you don't have an opinion. That's a very valid criticism to make, and to ignore that criticism is to yield in some way that your birth circumstances somehow mean you do not get a say in things. Like, it's a very black and white issue. Either we can talk about these things based on our lived experiences and the people we wish to advocate for, or we can't. I am personally on the side, as I think you are, of us all being able to talk about these things and us all having an opinion on these things, whether we're in the minority, whether we're in the majority, whether we happen to be male, female, or something weird in between.
In talking about trans rights. So that's the first issue. She was in fact not really talking about trans rights at all. The second issue though is, even if she did speak about trans issues as someone who is not trans, and then said that Zach can't speak about women's issues because he is not a woman, that still wouldn't make her a hypocrite.
But it would. That's what, if you're speaking on trans rights while not being trans, as if you have an opinion without those lived experiences, but you say that somebody can't speak on positions about being a woman and the rights of womanhood because they were not born a woman, then you have taken a hypocritical position, and pointing that out is a valid thing to do.
Because she is of the opinion that being a woman actually means something, while being trans doesn't.
Okay, so she's not a hypocrite because she's stupid? Like, I'm just curious. What does that point actually mean? Because that sounds like you're saying that she's not a hypocrite because she has an opinion that is wrong and dumb. I don't know what I'm supposed to get from this other than, again, the reading comprehension thing from earlier.
Doesn't. She's saying, hey Zach, you haven't grown up female, you haven't internalized the way society understands women as relating to you, you haven't experienced female puberty, or the danger of being the physically weaker sex. She's basically saying there are a lot of unique experiences that come with being a woman because men and women are clearly distinct, and Zach isn't going to be able to relate to the women's experiences because he is a man.
Okay, so those are fair points, and I would like to address them each one by one. So, on the note of being the physically weaker sex, did you know that with hormone therapy, which most trans people who have the opportunity to end up going through, here, I'll link to a study again, because again, I feel like your rhetoric loses to data. For trans women, which is the subject of the conversation, hormone therapy actually rapidly reduces all of the levels that would be required for somebody to have very good strength. Now, granted, there is a segment of this strength that is kept during the first 3 years of hormone therapy, but the longer somebody is on hormones, the longer they have lived this experience, the more they will become as close to the physically weaker sex as you can get. Because it turns out the chemicals that cause a woman to be the physically weaker sex are the chemicals that we are pumping through them with hormone therapy. As for the point about the lived experience of being a woman, you're right. Some trans women will not have the lived experience of being a woman, but they will have the lived experience of being a trans woman. This means that if they're on hormone therapy, guess what? They will actually be going through female puberty. That's what hormone therapy does. It produces a second puberty. This is the reason why when people go on hormone blockers, in order to stop them from engaging in their first puberty and then get hormone therapy, it's so that their first puberty ends up actually being the one that aligns with their gender. It's what the chemicals do, my guy. But if the conversation is going to be about the lived experiences, that is one that I cannot take away from her, except for the fact that if a trans woman is passing and goes out in society, then her lived experiences are going to end up being the same as every other woman on the street. My partner is trans, and when I go out into society with my partner, she gets the experience of every other female because she is passing. Case in point, I live in a red district in Georgia's rural South. This is the one place where I would expect her to have a different lived experience based on that if that was something that people could identify. But they can't. But this is also ignoring the broader point that if our conversation is going to be about the lived experiences being something somebody cannot get, then guess what? You won't have the lived experience of being a trans person where everybody is debating whether you have rights to certain spaces. You won't have the lived experience of being a trans person who is medically dependent on a system that wants to tell you that you're not a legitimate human being. There are several things and several aspects of your lived experience that other people won't have, and just wanting to take a shit in peace is something that trans people uniquely have to worry about whether they'll be able to do. So if we're going to have the conversation about lived experiences, that conversation must invariably flow both ways. To your previous point about her thinking that trans people and trans identity means nothing and therefore she's not a hypocrite, no, that just makes her a hypocrite because she is uninformed, or worse, because she is stupid. Stupidity or ignorance does not make somebody not a hypocrite. It simply makes them uninformed as to why they are a hypocrite.
The problem is, there aren't distinct experiences that come with being trans, because being trans versus being cis isn't a clear distinction.
Okay, so we're back to the ignorance and the inability to read thing. All right, let me pull up a study. I feel like if there was nothing distinctive about being trans, then you wouldn't have the American Psychological Association having so much writing on people who are trans. But, you know, what do I know? I guess the ideas of gender dysphoria and gender euphoria, which are uniquely talked about in trans spaces, are also not things that are unique to the trans experience, or at least are heavily influenced by the trans experience. I guess society arguing every single day over whether you have the right to shit in a place is not a uniquely trans experience, despite the fact that right now it is. I guess for trans women, getting period symptoms because their ADHD caused them to forget their hormone therapy that week is not also a uniquely trans experience. I feel like to argue that there is no unique experience between cis and trans people is to argue entirely from ignorance, and it's a good reason for me to click off of your video, because if this is the level of rhetoric, if this is the level of research, if this is the level of care that you take when you go into your topics, then I have to assume that you are either a malicious actor or a moron, and in either case, I have no reason to watch any more of your content.
Yeah. I also want to touch on another issue, which is that all of this is talking about rights, but you don't know what rights a group should have if you can't actually identify and therefore talk about that group.
All right, a couple of things here. One, if you are a trans member of my audience, let me know in the comment section below. Let me know what your lived experiences are, and let me know how you figured out that you are trans, because I'm sure that would help our lovely interlocutor here figure out how to identify somebody who is trans. After all, we wouldn't have any writing on, like, trans people at all if there were not some things we could use to identify them. Usually we rely on, you know, the person telling us that they're trans, and that's a pretty good signifier that they are trans, because we can't exist in their head. We cannot figure out what they actually mean, believe, etc. We have to take them on their word. But you know, there's other things that we have to do that with too, like depression. So we've commonly had this idea for years that like depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain, but we don't actually have any way to measure that. We don't have a way to measure depression, really, not in the same way as really anything else. We can diagnose it, but we mostly do it based off of survey results. We mostly do it based off the hearsay of the person who says they are depressed.
After all, what did Zach Polanski say women's rights are?
Women's rights, I believe, from speaking to women that they want us to be talking about, is violence against women and girls, not being able to get a gynecology appointment, the gender pay gap.
Honestly, I think the woman who's arguing against him here missed a trick by letting this go unchallenged. By even saying there's such a thing as women's rights, he's admitting there exists a distinct category of women.
So again, there's 2 points here that I feel like I need to address. Point one is, I don't think that it's a good point at all. Like when you say, hey, you admitted that women's rights exist. Gotcha, liberal. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. That doesn't make any sense, because nobody who's arguing for trans rights, at least as far as I know, is also simultaneously arguing that women's rights are not a thing, and then women are not distinct in any way, shape, or form. Nobody's arguing that. You've created a straw man because it's easier to fight against. Also, you focused on the gynecology part as if that was some kind of gotcha, but again, this kind of just shows that you haven't done any research into the topic while still having an opinion on it. Here, allow me to show you. So gynecologists do pap smears, vaginal, uterine, and ovarian cervical health screening, breast cancer screening, tests for STIs, contraception and family planning, and hormone therapy, which means that one of the people you will be seeing a lot as a trans woman is a gynecologist. And not just for the hormone therapy, but for the testing for the STIs and the breast cancer screening, because guess what? The thing that causes breast cancer is having the breasts in the first place. When you are a trans woman, your chance of getting breast cancer goes up a fuck ton. It also notes here that any trans woman who's had reconstructive surgery will end up needing gynecological care for their new vulva and vagina. And it also notes that anyone with breast tissue will now need breast cancer screenings. I said that before actually reading into the article because I've studied this before. Also, it notes that trans women who are undergoing gender-affirming care... It also notes that trans women who are going through gender-affirming therapy still end up getting PMS just without the bleeding, because there's a lot more that goes into it, like the cramps and the emotional instability, than just the bleeding. And of course, for all of that, you're gonna end up going to a gynecologist. This isn't a gotcha. This just shows you've done zero research on a subject that you have a lot of opinions on. There's nothing wrong with having opinions on a subject, but if you are going to speak with any authority on it, like you are doing on your channel, then you owe it to yourself and your audience to actually do some research. It will make your content far better, and it will be far better for you as well, just as a person. Typically, when I hit this point in a video where I realize that I'm going to be seeing rehashed talking points and I'm going to be seeing absolutely zero in the form of research, just straight up rhetoric with no actual backing to it, this is my moment to bow out. And I would hope for most of you, this is your moment to bow out of damn near any video as well. Once somebody has spoken with authority on something and been wrong very, very often, and not actually done any research on what they are trying to argue about, the fair thing to do is to walk away from that and no longer engage in that content, because it's not supplying you with anything other than things to be angry at. So here's where I want to make the pitch to you at least one more time. If you value fair and honest political analysis that tries to make this whole sphere a little less miserable, do me a favor, subscribe and tell 3 friends what I'm doing over here. Hopefully you found my analysis of this video to be fair. And if you did, let me know in the comment section below. And if you didn't, if there's anything that I missed that you think I should have covered, then please let me know that as well. But from where I'm sitting, I've basically got everything that I think I'm going to get out of this. Sources for everything that I looked up will be in the description below, and I greatly appreciate each and every one of you being here. And speaking of places where you could be, if you have not already, please consider checking out my Neko Suris live channel or my Suris MTG channel. Live is where I go over the news, and MTG is where I talk about Magic the Gathering, and hopefully if K-Fox is being a wonderful editor, then she will have all of that here on screen for you right now. Links to both those channels will be in the description, and thank you so much for watching. As always, everybody, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, you made it to the end. I want to give an extra thanks to the patrons who allow me to do this full time. I want to thank Aaron Rail, Astral, Britzkrieg, Jemshin, Poundini, Red Joker, Victoria, Jonas, Craig, Tarika, Fireshard, Smiling GM, John, Dren Hadamada, Creeper, Sagittarius, you know I'm not saying that last part, Valis of Sereth, Ottoman Angel, Rooster Rachel, and Fire Panda, who are all my $20 and up patrons.